appropriately. And this one's going to be a little bit weird. And so this is going to be the blurriest one that there is, guys. And it's just because for some reason they uploaded a hack sheet in here. And so for me to blow it up, it gets a little odd. So what we are looking at, and through this whole time, guys, if you have a question, take yourself off mute, throw up the hands, do whatever, get our attentions. This is for you guys 100%. So if you're thinking it, someone else is thinking it. And again, we have managing brokers on this call. What I would ask though is don't specifically say commissions. Go, X, Y, kind of move from there. So the very first thing that they said is commission charged by brokerage firm is not set by law. And it used to say that it was the real estate brokerage firms. Well, through this whole commission thing that's been going on, the brokerage firm says we never have. And on top of we never have, going forward, we're going to get rid of some other language that may make our agents think otherwise. So right now they just go, it's fully negotiable. RE/MAX, all these other brokerages, they put it in their settlement agreements around this brokerage firm compensation. And now everything is going to be written as fully negotiable. Nothing's changed, just the language. So if we're looking at this thing, this is your exclusive right to sell. And we're scrolling through the exclusive right to sell. And while some things are going to start popping up, there's not a whole lot of changes to this thing. But here we go. So compensation. So here it is. We're looking at compensation to the brokerage firm, compensation to the buyer brokerage firm. All right. So again, one of the biggest changes, they're no longer calling it commission, they're calling it compensation. So compensation, as we look at this thing, is they've gone through and there is these two boxes that are brand new. You can see that the first box, 7111, and it's really just reading the percentage. Seller's brokerage firm may enter into a compensation agreement with the buyer's brokerage firm to contribute from the sales compensation amount of X% of the gross price or dollars. All right. So what we're going through and we're doing here is 711 talks about the total. So let's call, X percentage. And then 7111 actually talks about the commission that out of that X% is going to be offered to the buyer side of things, to the co-op. All right. So as we're looking at this thing, it's not a huge change, but it's definitely a change. We're going to call out both numbers. The first number is the total, and the second number is how much of a co-op is going to be given out. And it says if seller agrees to pay the buyer's brokerage firm pursuant to the contract between buyer and seller, seller's compensation to the seller's brokerage firm will be reduced by that amount and not to exceed the buyer's brokerage firm's compensation. So they're really just spelling it out. And I don't know about you guys, but I have been in conversations with sellers in the past, not experienced sellers, but maybe first-time home sellers. And when you're having the conversation about your commission, and then you get to the second subsection where you start talking about the buyer co-op, I've had conversations where like, so I'm paying you this plus an additional X percentage. This is going to alleviate that confusion. So they're going through, you're listing your number for the total. Then you're going through and you're listing the buyer co-op side of things if they agree to it. And then that second section on 7112 lets them know that it's actually coming out of the total. Any questions around that? Cool. That's pretty straightforward, right, guys? Like that's the most straightforward thing. And they really just spelled it out. Because again, I don't know if you guys have run into this, but I have, where this isn't super clear sometimes. It's going through the leases, it's going through commission earns. And again, all these red lines, it's going from commission to compensation. That's the biggest change. You can see that there isn't a whole lot going on. And we're through the contract, right? There was not a lot of big stuff in here. Really nothing. So the big one, right? And here's where we're going to have some conversation. We're going to probably have some conversation around the CBS as well. So again, we're looking at this top piece, and the biggest part of we're having these conversations and we're talking about the exclusive right to buy. We need to be very, very comfortable having these conversations and be very, very comfortable getting a piece of paper signed. And we'll look at it as we go forward, but you guys are going to notice that it pretty much says that if we don't have a document in place that actually states our commission, we work for free. Like that's the language in here. If we do not have a piece of paper signed before we enter into the CBS, we work for free. So let's look at this thing. As we're going through, is this compensation? Same thing, fully negotiable, which is just different language, but it's always been negotiable. We're talking about this contracts for sale. Again, nothing on here. So these are all the same. But here's your compensation. So let me scroll in a little bit more. So it says compensation to the brokerage firm in consideration of the services to be performed by the brokerage firm will be paid as set forth in this section with no discount or allowances for any effort made by the buyer or other person. So it doesn't matter what they do, our fee is our fee, and that's the exclusive right. We understand that. Brokerage firm is not entitled to receive additional compensation, bonuses, and incentives paid by the brokerage firm or seller. So guys, the bonuses are gone. So if you go through and you say, I am worth X, and they're offering Y, which is a bigger amount, you cannot collect it based off of this. Now, there has been some conversation. We've talked about it. And Kevin, if you want to weigh in, or Bob, you want to weigh in about maybe an amendment to the contract for compensation. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I do think you have the ability to do an amendment just like you would with a seller based on a particular transaction. I think where you're going to have trouble is if you've undervalued your compensation in your buyer listing agreement. Let's say you hypothetically went to 2% or 1.5% or some low number, and they're offering a higher number like 2.5 or 2.8 or even 3. Trying to get them to agree to an amendment versus getting the purchase price dropped down or that excess being able to be used by the buyer toward closing costs may be challenging. So if you're unsuccessful or unconfident in negotiating your value in a higher percentage, it may be challenging to get that amend extend actually signed in order to get the extra compensation.
So Kevin, if I heard you right, one of your thoughts is that if you're going, and we'll use numbers because it's just easier. If we say 2.8% and they're offering 3, and we're like, hey, Mr. and Mrs. Buyer, will you amend this contract and allow me to collect that additional 0.2%? They may say something along the lines of, Kevin, what if we were to use that extra money? Because I already agreed to the 2.8, but can we use that for me? And would you give me that money instead as the buyer? Yeah, guys, we could run into that, right? Like that could be the thing. If you're going through and you're discounting, and that was a small percentage, if you're discounting
well, I was going to
yourself
say
down to 2%.
that one's probably pretty easy. I could see the buyer going, sure, you've done a great job and you've shown me 60 properties. But if it's a 1% difference on an $800,000 house, that's $8,000. You may not get that buyer to agree down the road to give you an extra $8,000 versus they get to keep the $8,000 and use it in the contract itself to pay toward closing costs.
Yeah. So guys, that's the biggest thing. Like as you're thinking about this, you're going to want to make sure that you're putting what you're worth. And so I think it's going to be very tempting to be going into a conversation where you are competing against maybe other people, or in your head you're competing and you're not thinking that you're worth your amount that you are worth, and you absolutely are. And you go through and you're like, well, hey, this is the thing. I don't want you to be stuck with, paying this. I'll do X. And then you walk into that scenario, just like Kevin said, where it's a 1% difference and you try to get it, and they're going to say, give it to us, take it off the commission. I want you to work a little bit harder at this point, negotiate even more for me. And you could be running into some issues. So going down, again, no red lines, and who will pay. All right. So we have 731, 732. And as we're looking at these, it says this, it says seller brokerage firm. So again, I think that even as real estate agents, we have an issue with, listing versus selling broker. And so they're just calling it out. They're like seller's brokerage. So seller's brokerage firm or the seller may pay, buyer is obligated to pay. Buyer is authorized and instructed to request payment of brokerage firm's success fee from one or both of the following: the seller's brokerage firm and the seller. All right. So this box 731 gives you permission to enter into the CBS to ask for compensation. 731. Buyer is obligated to pay any portion of the broker's success fee. It doesn't say broker, it says proportion of the success fee, which is not paid by the seller's brokerage firm or seller, but only if broker discloses the buyer the amount the buyer must pay in writing and prior to the buyer entering into a contract with the seller. So two things, right? It's saying that firstly, you are allowed to enter into the CBS, which this line item really hasn't changed too much. This is the only line item, the only checkbox that allowed you to enter into the CBS to ask for commission. The second thing, as we're looking at this thing, is it says the only way you're allowed to ask for any money, right? Because it says, but only if broker discloses to buyer the amount buyer must pay in writing and prior to buyer entering into the contract with the seller. So if you do not have a compensation agreement in place prior to writing the CBS, there is no such thing as procuring cause anymore. Procuring cause is gone. So you have no procuring cause. The MLS does not list at this point, right? There's no compensation in the MLS. You will be working for free. And and Kevin, Bob, tell me what your thoughts are on this. So let's just say that we get to a point, because I actually saw this in a Facebook group today, which is why Facebook is so dangerous. So you're working with this person and you find out today that there's no compensation. Kevin, can I walk away from this deal and just be like, well, hey, I think it might be better if you go work with the seller directly?
So I just had a conversation with one of my top producers in Castle Rock, and they checked 7.3.3, which is no longer in this new listing contract. And we had this exact conversation. And I said, since you don't have any language in there to negotiate your compensation, if you show a property that's not offering buyer broker compensation and that buyer wants to go after that property, you're at the mercy of the buyer if they're going to pay you. They have absolutely zero obligation to pay you. You're in a contract, an employment agreement that you cannot exercise an out just because you're not going to get paid. And this broker understood. He's been working with this buyer for 6 months, and he's like, well, if I end up working for free, I end up working for free, because you're not going to have a choice.
So guys be thinking about that, right? As you're going and you're doing these different things. And this also goes back to that percentage, right? Is that we're going in here and we have to have these things in place. Now, one of the issues that I think that we have in Colorado, which is also, maybe one of the benefits that we have, is that we have the ability to be in a transaction brokerage status, right? We can be a TB. And a TB, and Kevin, I don't think this is going away, and Bob, feel free to jump in, but TB status, we still don't need to have a agency agreement in place. Now, we can't be a fiduciary, right? That means that they ask us questions, they ask us for our advice, they ask us, the pros and cons about it. We have no opinion, right? We are neutral, we're a referee, we're Switzerland, and all we're doing is we're turning keys and we're writing paperwork based off of what they tell us to do. So if we think that we're going to operate in a TB capacity without this documentation in place, and they want to go write an offer, and we think that we're going to write the offer, get it accepted, and put together all the agency agreement, this is where you could be working for free, 100%. Because let's say you write on that offer and they're offering zero, right? You put this offer in, they got 2-3 offers, your offer wasn't the strongest, and there's no compensation on it. Your buyer's not obligated, neither is the seller. So we need to be pretty cognizant.
Real quick. I want to be sure of what I just heard you say. We do not do transaction broker verbal is not an option in this office. Office policy requires agency relationship. And even if you drop to a transaction broker because you're holding the buyer's hand and holding the seller's hand, you still need a written transaction broker agreement in place. The broker's disclosure to buyer is not enough. And Marsha Waters has come out on that as well. She's been very clear that her expectation is a written agreement, a written listing agreement as a transaction broker with that buyer. At least for that, you can do a one property
Transaction.
buyer listing agreement with them.
Absolutely. So let's play this, Kevin. So, what if, they're still kind of hesitant. I know some people in the past, have been like, well, let me just show you like 1, 2 houses, and maybe I'll give you like a 1 day, couple hours, and then you can see what I'm willing to do for you. And let's say that we do that transaction brokerage status still right before they sign an agency agreement, and they want to write on an offer.
So you're going to have two choices, and we may be putting the cart before the horse a little bit. One is so let me be really clear about this, and this is important. Damian talked about this as well, and Marsha Waters has definitely implied how she's going to handle this. We have to realize that the NAR settlement, the KW settlement, all these settlements are not in alignment with the state of Colorado, meaning the state of Colorado does not require any type of listing agreement or compensation agreement in order to open a door and show a property. However, our settlement does require us to enter into a compensation agreement. Now, they modified the broker's disclosure to buyer and added a third page that can be used as a broker compensation agreement to allow you to show properties. However, it does not obligate the buyer to work with you. The only obligation that we have would be an actual listing, a written listing agreement. Now you could, and that's the easy button in order to show a property, but just understand, just because you show it doesn't give you procuring cause, and they can end around you and go straight to the listing agent and ask them to write the offer directly. If you enter into a short-term or property-specific listing agreement, again, you have to fill out the compensation part of that agreement. That's another way that you can open doors for a short period of time. Again, my feeling is that's an agency relationship. That's not a TB. And when you're now, you will be a TB. You have to be a TB with the broker's disclosure to buyer. So you have to check those boxes on the broker's disclosure to buyer. They cannot be a customer. And the only way you can be in an agency relationship is if you have a listing agreement in place. So does that kind of clarify it?
Yeah, absolutely. So guys, what we're hearing and what's being said is that you have to have these agreements in place. There is no going out for numerous reasons. One, I don't think that you're covered. If a lawsuit comes your way and it finds out that you actually did not have an agency agreement in place, the blanket from NAR and the blanket from KW does not protect you, and your E&O insurance won't. So if you find yourself in a situation because you didn't have an agency agreement signed, you're no longer protected by NAR, you're no longer protected by KW, and you're not going to be protected by your E&O insurance either. We have to have these agreements in place. And this is the importance of this conversation, is that I know that some of us want to play like, I'm worried about putting my value out there, but I promise you guys are valuable. Like, you have a value proposition, and maybe it's just worth, maybe we're going to put down paper and we're going to be able to go through it and have some conversations around it, but you don't want to be caught here.
Now, the one other clarification I want to make, and this is extremely important, because the state is not in alignment with our settlement, and that's because there's 51,000 plus licensed brokers in the state of Colorado. Just a little over half of those brokers are part of the settlement. The others are not part of the settlement and don't fall into a requirement of having to have a brokerage compensation agreement in order to show property. So one of the things you have to be very careful of is you cannot tell the public, Joe Public, that you have to have a listing agreement in order to show them property. If they say, no, I'm not going to do that with you, and then they go to the next broker and a broker fills out the compensation agreement with the buyer, with the broker's disclosure to buyer, and they file a complaint on you, I think the commission's going to come down on you hard, because there's a difference between the requirement of a listing agreement and the requirement for a brokerage compensation agreement. And so the broker's compensation agreement is just an understanding and agreement that if they work with you, this is what you're going to get paid. That brokerage the brokerage compensation is inside the listing agreement, but they're not required to sign a listing agreement in order for you to show them property, just the brokerage compensation agreement. So be very careful in how you talk to the public. That's the easy button. I get it. You would love to tell buyers, hey, you have no choice. It's the only way I can show you property. That's not accurate. They do not need to enter into a listing agreement, just the brokerage compensation agreement.
And so just so you guys all are aware, right, with what Kevin just said, it's a pretty level playing field at the very least, though. When we're talking about the brokerages that are doing the majority of the business, we are talking about also the brokerages that have done these settlement agreements, and we're all in the same playing field. Yes, there are some brokerages, these smaller boutique brokerages, maybe these Colorado-owned brokerages that don't have to play by these same rules, yet they're also not protected. You guys have so many protections if anything else comes your way, and we're not done seeing this. Once this vein gets tapped dry, they're going to start coming for these smaller brokerages at the same time. You guys are protected, and so we just need to make sure that we're following the rules to keep you protected. The second one, right? Oh, go ahead. Yes.
So if I understand you, because I went to the state and pulled up the clean version, it's not the final version, but the clean version of the broker disclosure. And on the third page, there's a buyer's broker compensation agreement. So if I'm understanding you correctly, if we have the customer, the potential buyer, fill this out, if we fill it out and we have this signed, then that's all we need in order to show them property?
You said everything correct except for the word customer. They can't be a customer. They have to be a TV relationship in order to have a compensation agreement in place.
They have to have a transaction broker. Okay.
So the time we use, so here's what's going to happen. No, they're on the brokerage disclosure to buyer. So what's going to happen is on the brokerage disclosure to buyer, if you represent the seller and they want to see the property, scroll up, Charles. You're going to fill this out just like you should have been doing before, which is you're going to go down here, you're going to check customer, because initially they're going to be a customer, but you're not going to fill out the third page with the brokerage, with the compensation agreement, because you're not entering into a relationship with that buyer, and you have the right to show that property because you represent the seller. Now, let's say you're holding somebody else's property open and they get to talking to you and they like you and say, hey, you know, there's a couple other houses I'd like to go see. Now scroll up again, Charles. Then you're going to complete this brokerage disclosure to buyer, and you're going to check the TB box, the transaction broker box, and then you're going to fill out the third page. You do not fill the third page out when you represent the seller and you're going to show the property.
Gotcha. Thank you.
Cool. Awesome. So then 732, right? Just buyer will pay. Buyer is obligated to pay the brokerage firm. Brokerage firm is not entitled to receive any additional compensation unless agreed into with the buyer in writing. So we have two, right? 731 and 732. One is brokerage firm can, buyer will, and the second box is buyer will. Those are your only two boxes now, right? We're going through and they've cut this one out, and there is no more listing, brokerage firm, or seller may pay. That's gone. They are both on your buyer. Your buyer is obligated either way, but your buyer has given you permission, if you check 731, to enter into the CBS and ask for a commission. Any questions on those two boxes, guys? 732 is gone. Or 733, I'm sorry. Yes.
I have a quick question. We still have every right as realtors to turn down someone's business should they decide not to sign a buyer agency with us at the beginning, correct?
100%.
Thank you.
Quick question. So for clients that you've got kind of in transition that you already have an agreement with and that you are moving into this like past the August point, I assume we just redo all the forms at that point?
Well, that's your call. It's not necessary. So the seller listing agreement is definitely not necessary. If they've agreed to offer a buyer broker compensation, that's valid still through it. With the buyer broker, however, if you check 7.3.3 because you hit the easy button,
didn't do that.
You'll be working for free potentially down the road. So if you check 7.3.1, you're covered. You're good.
Okay. Thanks.
Perfect, everyone. So I mean, go ahead.
I have a question. Can you scroll up so I can see 7.3.1?
Yes.
So what I read there is the same as before, where buyer is obligated to pay, and that's what you're checking. But then in addition, if you're writing a contract, your client is offering to purchase a home, and that listing is only offering, say, 2.5, and you've told them you want 3%. Before submitting, I guess you have to know before you submit the offer that they're only offering 2.5, and that your buyer's going to be obligated to pay you. And you have to again write that in writing, because now you've got the amount that they would have to. Sorry, that was funky.
That's flipped, I think. Kevin, go ahead.
No, that's not accurate. So here's what's going to happen. If you try to find out ahead of time, you can enter into, and you want to show that other form, the listing agreement between brokerage firms, you can enter into an agreement between the brokerage firms. And this is the new form that Damien and Damien and the Bar Association created for us. You know, I had a long conversation with Damien a couple of days ago, because we had a situation arise in Evergreen about a buyer broker that's not going to get paid. However, I don't think this form is going to take in the end, because it's going to cause too much, you know, complications trying to get this form agreed to before we even write a contract. Mm-hmm. And, you know, I wish I could tell you that I want this form to be used. I wished it would be used, but I don't think it's going to happen. So when we get to the purchase contract, there's going to be a new section 29, 29.1, 29.2, and 29.3. And I think most of us are going to go in negotiating, and we're just going to negotiate. We're going to negotiate what we expect to get paid. And if we can't get the full amount, the difference can be picked up by the buyer, or we can waive it with the buyer, depending on what we want to do with them. I just think this is going to become more hassle than it's worth. I mean, what listing broker doesn't immediately answer their phone or call you right back, right? And you need to get this offer in a timely manner. So I just don't see this form getting used like I'd like to see it used.
Yeah. So if your compensation agreement reads 2.5, they're offering 3%, you get 2.5. Unless you maybe do an amend, which Kevin just kind of alluded to a couple slides back. Yep. And if you're agreed to 3 and they're offering 2.5, then you're having to go through and either charge your buyer the additional 0.5%, or you can waive it just like we've been able to in the past. You do not have to charge your buyer additional funds. Kevin, you in alignment with that?
Yeah, the answer is going to be in the purchase contract under section 29. Somebody asked earlier, do you have to send your listing agreement into the lender? They may ask for it, but the information is going to be in the contract. And let's just run through some numbers again. Let's say you negotiate and you're asking your agreement on your buyer listing contract is 3%, and you negotiate and they're like, no, we're only going to pay you 2.5. The seller's only going to pay 2.5. Then you're going to check 21.1, 29.1, and 29.2. 29.1 is going to have 2.5 being paid from the seller, and you're going to have the buyer paying the buyer broker 0.5 to make up the total 3. Now that's when you're over. That's a wonderful world to be in. Let's say it's the opposite. Let's say that the agreement you have with your buyer is they're only going to pay you 2%, and the offering is 3%. Now you're going to go in there and you're going to put 2% from the seller being paid to the buyer, and that extra 1%, you're going to have to go after the purchase price, or you're going to have to go for a concession toward the buyer's closing costs if the buyer won't agree to an amend extend for this one property to increase your compensation.
Quick question.
Right.
If the compensation amounts don't agree, obviously we fix that in the contract, but at what point in time then, so does the amendment with the buyer for the buyer's agreement need to be done immediately at that point in time as well? Or is that something that we do after, or when does that happen? You know what I mean?
You need to do that before the contract is consummated between the buyer and the seller, because how you're going to be paid is going to be determined there. So you're going to have to just do an amend extend for that one property contract only. Yep.
Okay.
All right. You guys seeing this, right? Like if we devalue ourselves and we go 2%, 2.2, a percentage, like whatever that number is, like there's a lot of legwork that goes back into making sure that that compensation's right. And there are people that, I mean, even Mitch, right? For those that have been in coffee talk, Mitch believes that lenders are going to start requiring the paperwork to go in. So there's going to be a lot of people checking over this information, whether what they're going to do with it, who knows? But you're going to want to make sure we're doing everything on the front end and then maybe reversing it back, because that's a lot easier than actually going low and then putting it back in on the back end.
I will say there's another complication here, and that is when your buyer either chooses that they're not going to pay you, period, that they either get something from the seller or they're moving on, or they can't. They don't have the financial bandwidth to be able to pay you. So what's going to end up happening, since you're probably not going to make solid contact with the listing agent ahead of time to come to an agreement, you may not even know if they're offering or not, you're going to go in and you're going to negotiate 29.1 that the seller's going to pay. And if they come back and they say absolutely not, that's why you're going to have additional language in your listing agreement, which we'll go over in additional provisions, probably not today because I don't think we're going to have time, but where you're going to say, where you're going to have the buyer instruct you that you're not going to write on offers that they're not going to provide some type of concession to help, because they don't have the financial ability to move forward. So they just need to go in, and you need to be aware of as well. If you don't find out ahead of time, like if you don't go through the listings that you're going to show on the day you're showing property, and you don't identify the ones that are not offering a broker comp and prepare them for that, or get a hold of the listing agent to find out if there's anything negotiable, you're going to be in the situation that my Evergreen broker's in right now, which is a really awkward situation. They lowered the price. A buyer broker from the city came in and wrote a contract, asked for $15,000 seller at all from the listing agent, and she's not doing anything wrong. She's doing what her seller told her to do, and she wanted to poke the buyer broker and say, "Hey, look, you're blowing it here. You're missing this." And her seller said, "No, you don't do that. You're under a fiduciary responsibility to me. I'm accepting this contract the way it is, and I am not offering any buyer broker comp." And so that's the piece that we're going to have to really work closely with our buyers, so they understand that in some cases you may have to pass up a house you really like, or figure out how you can compensate me.
Kevin, will you redo that? You went out of voice. We couldn't hear you.
Yeah. So can you hear me okay now? Okay. I think I'm holding the mic the wrong way. How about now? Is that better?
It was,
Okay.
yeah, Kevin, you're good. It was just, it blanked out. We could see you talking and
Okay.
everything. It's not like you
So-
froze.
so
It was
what
after
I'm saying is-
15,000.
Is we'll have to add language into our buyer listing contracts, and I'll teach this when I teach the listing contract coming up, that if a buyer doesn't have the financial capability to compensate you, that they're not going to pursue those properties, because otherwise we would be held hostage to a situation where they can't come up with their down payment, their closing costs, and compensation for the buyer broker. So they need to be aware that they're not going to be able to pursue those properties when a seller just stands firm and says, under no conditions am I going to compensate the buyer broker. Does that come through okay?
Yeah. So
Okay.
when we were kind of looking at the exclusive right, and we were talking about 29, right? Because this is a brand new section. And so we're going to move off the exclusive right to buy. There's not a whole lot more that's left in there, but let's talk about the CDS.
I have one
And-
question real quick before we move
Yes.
forward. On the exclusive right to buy, so would we put that in more like 3.4 on there, that if no because it says acceptable to buyer. So if they're not offering a co-op, is that where we would say only if sellers want to pay a co-op?
So I think you got to be able to talk to your buyer and say, if the seller isn't going to pay me, then you're going to be on the hook for this 3.4. So I think that's probably going to be a hard conversation to have. They need to understand, because you're either checking 7.3.1 or 7.3.2. And my guess is the buyer's not going to be okay paying you 3.4 if a broker down the street will do it for 2.5. So I think you're in the same negotiating standpoint. Now, don't get me wrong. I'm not saying you can't get more, but I think you got to demonstrate value. Like, for example, let's say Bill Davis is going to be your buyer broker, and you're looking at ranches all over the state of Colorado. I can see him negotiating a higher fee structure that the buyer would be obligated if the seller doesn't offer it. But I think that's going to be not the norm. That's not going to be your norm.
Kim, I think that that's a dangerous place to play in. I think that if we go through and we're just elevating our commission and putting a provision in there that says, hey, don't worry about it, I'm not going to charge you that, but I just want to protect myself. And I think if someone gets wind that we're doing that, they're going to think that we're keeping the commission prices elevated, and we're going to just open ourselves up for a lawsuit.
Well, and you can't do that anyways. And that the reason is the settlement says it has to be an ascertainable number. That means it has to be a specific number. It can't be this or less or this or more. It's got to be a specific percentage or a specific dollar amount.
Yeah.
Quick question, as a listing agent, obviously we're not allowed to put any type of cooperating compensation in the MLS. Does it say that we are not allowed to do it anywhere else, like social media, email blasts, those types of things? Because I will do it if I can, but I don't want to get in trouble.
Yeah, what I don't think we're going to end up going that route, and I don't think we're going to talk about bananas or strawberries or any code language or anything like that. I think it's just going to be part of the new norm in negotiating. And we're gonna probably write some contracts where the seller initially was like, absolutely, I'm not going to pay anything out. And we negotiate, we either get the deal under contract with compensation being allocated or not. And
Okay.
here's basically where the DOJ is kind of weighing in on this. I think they're calling it the one click. You can't be one click away from the MLS with any information about buyer broker comp being offered from the
Okay.
listing brokerage firm.
Okay, gotcha.
And KWRI is considered one click. Your websites are considered one click. So, it's going to have to be some other third-party platform. And I just think that's going to be too much work in the end. And,
Okay.
I just think you're going to end up negotiating, and it's either going to work or it's not. And, it's just another fee that the buyer has to evaluate. It's another term the buyer has to evaluate. We already had one deal that closed where the buyer was paid by the buyer broker was paid by the buyer. And that's how they went in as a strategy to get the deal under contract. And it's really 6 or a half dozen in the end. They just lowered the price basically, and the buyer compensated the buyer broker directly, or the brokerage firm.
Okay.
All right. Let's see, as we're jumping into this, guys, while there are red lines through this contract, there's a lot of things going on.
And
This will definitely be what Kevin covers.
Yeah, I'll teach on that when I teach the contracts class. There was some solar panel stuff and some lease.
Septic,
They just cleaned up some of the language that they did add septic use permit language. I was really happy about that.
Yeah,
but I'll teach on all of that with the new contracts.
Yep, perfect. So here's the big one. All right, guys. So 29, as we're looking at 29, you can see that if we were to scroll back down here where a lot of agents, especially newer agents, forget that like the contract actually still goes on, they removed this. All right. So this section of the contract is now a line item before our signatures, which I think is awesome, right? This is, I think, one of the first things that agents just forgot to do as you were getting everything done. You signed, and then they're like, oh my God, there's more stuff to check. And while there is still more stuff to check, the compensation piece is now gone. So brokerage firm's compensation is actually above. So we're not saying listing broker, we're not saying buyer, we're not saying other anymore. It is clearly spelled out right here. So this is what Kevin's been alluding to on the exclusive rights the whole time, is this section 29. It says buyer's brokerage firm compensation will be paid at closing as follows. And we've got 3 different check boxes. We can say a percentage of the purchase price or a dollar amount by the seller. Buyer's brokerage firm as the intended third-party beneficiary under this provision only. This amount paid by the seller under this provision is in addition to any other concessions. That's what the amount is. That's concessions. Seller is paying on behalf of the buyer elsewhere in this contract. So that's our first one, the seller. Seller pays. The second one is percentage or dollar amount by buyer pursuant to a separate agreement between the buyer and the buyer's brokerage firm. This amount may be modified between the buyer and buyer's brokerage firm outside of this contract. So if your buyer's paying it, you're still putting it in the CBS. You're still putting it in here so that your buyer, if you go in and you're offering 123 Main Street, 123 Main Street's offering 0 or 2, and you're getting 2.8. This is where you're going to put those additional dollars in there. This is the additional dollars field. And then the third one, it says percentage of purchase price, price or dollar by a separate agreement between the buyer's brokerage firm and the seller's brokerage firm, which is saying that this is this, which
It's that other
may be,
document.
which is this document right here. So we're going through, we have 3 different checkboxes, guys. This is probably the biggest difference. Like, go ahead, Amanda.
And I just wanted to double check because in the prior conversation, I heard you and Kevin talking about, oh, you're going to check 29.1 and 29.2. So if it's going to be a combination of items, is that where that plays in?
Yeah, well, that's only if the seller's not offering enough of what you
Full.
agreed to in your buyer broker
Gotcha.
agreement. The one that's the scariest is you got to have that other document signed. So go to that other document, Charles. That listing agreement between brokerage firms, that has to be signed by the brokerage firms prior to you submitting an offer and checking 29.3. If you don't get that signed and you check 29.3, you're not going to get paid because there was never an agreement. Because remember, the contract up to Section A is between the buyer and the seller. So they can write whatever they want in there, but we're not a party to this contract. So if you check 29.3 and you don't have that other document signed, scroll down a little bit, Charles. This contract ends right there.
Here.
And everything below that is just informational purposes only. So for example, right now, with the situation where my broker represents the seller, the buyer broker filled this out that we're going to pay him. Well, we are going to pay him. It's just zero. That's what is in the MLS is zero. And the MLS is where the co-op, if you don't put it in the contract, that's the only other place where there's a co-op compensation agreement, which is in the process of going away. And that was zero, and it always has been zero. So it's unfortunate that we have a train wreck coming. And, you know, we may be in a situation where the buyer doesn't even have the financial wherewithal to pay them. And it's going to blow this contract up, which we're trying to explain to the seller. It's in their best interest to put this information out on the table now, because you go 3 weeks into this deal and then the buyer's like, I don't qualify for the loan anymore. That they're going to get out on loan availability at that point because they cannot financially compensate the buyer broker. If the buyer broker checks 7.3.3, they're working for free. And that's unfortunate.
But that's going away.
Yeah, that's all going away.
So guys, this is the big one. This is the biggest change when you're writing these offers. And so, Kevin, let's just talk about tactically. And I'm saying tactically in the sense of let's be lazy
Yeah, I just think it's going to become another term now. And so what's going to happen is to Renee's point, we may or may not know, depending on if the listing agent will respond to us or respond to a text or a phone call or an email or something to let us know if the seller's open to negotiating this. So I think we're just going to go in with the anticipation of negotiating under 29.1. And then however that kind of falls out, whatever difference is left under our listing agreement, they're going to owe us the difference. Whether it finds its way into this contract or not, they're still going to owe us the difference. Or to one of the broker's points, we could waive that. So let's say, they're offering 2.5 instead of 2.8. You've been showing them a lot of property, but it's like, hey, we're done. All right. It's worth it to me to be done showing properties and practicing writing contracts. You would have that ability to go, okay, we'll just go 2.5 at that point and do an amend extend on that one property to change it to 2.5. So it's entirely, the ball would be in your court how you're going to enforce that listing agreement at that point.
So, right, we all know this. Anyone that's written an offer in the last month, I say last month, really the last 3 years, listing agents don't like to answer their phone. Now, I know some of you listing agents just took offense to that. Most listing agents, except for the ones on this call,
I
don't
resemble
like to
the
answer
remark.
their phone. Yeah, any other outside brokerage listing agents don't like to answer their phone. And so, guys, being able to get this thing signed and then going through and doing this might not be in your client's best interest. Put it in the contract.
Yeah, if you had
and
to
let them
wait
counter.
for that agreement to get signed, you may be outside looking in, peeking through the window because while you were diddle-daddling around on the sidelines trying to get an agreement with the listing broker, they got 3 other offers put in with the 29.1 being checked. I just think that's going to be the least resistance is just negotiating in the contract, and then you're going to find out if the listing broker comes back with a counter and it says 0, and you call them and you're like, hey, if that's the case, my client can't move forward with your property. And so we're going to learn. We're going to learn through this process.
I have a question.
Yep, go ahead.
Yep.
Someone.
Yeah, so when we're, I guess I'm thinking about like preemptively going to show somebody a house, is it appropriate to call the listing agent that point and have a discussion about it and be able to bring it to your buyer's attention at that point and already be talking about it? Or is that not, is that rude?
Absolutely. That's how I'd handle it. And I did handle it that way. I had an out-of-state buyer looking between 1.2 and 1.4, and 2 of them didn't have compensation. So I just texted them. I said, hey, just need to understand the playground rules in the MLS. You don't have anything under broker comp, which is going to go away in the end.
Yeah.
I just need clarification if this is something that is expected to be covered by the buyer or not in an offer. And it was a mistake both times. Both of them were offering, and they told me what they were offering. Now, in the future, when we have no knowledge one way or the other, I can't see calling 6, 7, 8, 10 brokers or texting 10 brokers every single time I'm going out to show property. I'm going to go show the property and then just warn my clients, we don't know if there's a co-op being offered or not. So understand, if we do put an offer in on a property, either we got to have to bump the price up a little bit or ask for the compensation. You know, it just depends on how it's priced, right? Most of our comps are priced with the buyer broker compensation built into the value.
So Kevin, that's my biggest question is how could we put this in the contract prior? So we're not allowed to steer by any ways, but how can we let the buyers know?
Nope. Buyer can steer us. Absolutely.
The buyer can steer us. I get that.
Yeah.
But how do we do that in the contract that says, I do not have the funds to pay that, so you do not have to show me properties that are not offering a co-op?
Yeah, we put it under additional provisions in the listing agreement. Now, it's only if we know for a fact. Here's kind of my position. It's kind of like possession. You know, if you've ever taken my class, what do I say under possession in a listing agreement for a seller? What's the one word I write? Possession is negotiable. And what do I mean by that? Everything's negotiable. I don't care if a seller says that they're not going to be willing to offer compensation. If they're on the market at 800,000 and we make an 840 offer, let me think, 824 offer with them paying the seller compensation, the buyer broker compensation, that's a full price offer, right? It has to appraise, but that's a full price offer. So I think it's negotiable.
I'm thinking though, on the other side of it, when you're showing a first time buyer that has minimal, that they could come up their closing costs or down payment, they really can't afford that. And then we're up against a thing that you can offer that much more because it's definitely not going to appraise because they're already at the top of the market. So when you know that they cannot do that, how could you beat it to the punch to say here?
You're going to have to get a hold of the listing broker or write the offer and try and negotiate. And then when they come back and say there's no chance, then your buyer's going to have to walk away from that one.
That's such a waste of time, I feel, in between all of that. And you're getting the buyer's hopes up for no reason. Thinking they have a chance. And then you're looking like the
playground rules that we're stuck with. So you either get a hold of the listing broker or don't write the offer and move on to another property if the listing broker's lazy. So that's your only 3 options, right? Either A, you get a hold of the listing broker and find out what their position is. B, you write an offer, understanding the buyer, understanding the risk that if the seller is obstinate about it and will not offer anything, you're going to have to let that one die on the vine. Or 3, don't show the property at all with the instructions from your buyer in writing, telling you we don't want to take the chance that they're not going to cover it.
So you put that in the additional provisions in writing is where you put that.
Yep.
Okay.
And here's the thing,
it's
guys.
really going to come down to the buyers that either won't or cannot. That's what it's going to really come down to.
Do we have an approved clause for that, or can we ask Damien for some sort of an approved clause for that if that is something that we have clients that are needing that or wanting to put that in there?
Well, 2 things. One is I actually did write it in prior classes, so I'll bring it up again. It's really straightforward. You know, it's a straightforward class. Buyer instructs buyer broker to not show any properties not offering a compensation of at least whatever you've agreed to in your listing agreement. I can ask him. He hesitates to write a lot of these clauses, but I do think it's a clause that we need to be steered by the buyer, because, you know, Kimberly's absolutely right. We can't steer them. They have to steer us. And it's no different than telling us the price range they want to look at, the geographical area they want to look at, and the fact that they can't or will not have the ability to pay the buyer broker comp. They don't want to waste their time looking at houses that aren't offering a buyer broker comp compensation concession in the transaction.
And I think as we're going through this, guys, and we're looking at this, one of the biggest things we have to keep in mind is this isn't 2021, right? Their houses are sitting on the market longer. And we just looked at Arvada today, right? Arvada is anywhere from 30 days to 58 days. And so, yes, there's going to be homes that come on the market where there's going to be a lot of competition. And in all reality, the first-time home buyer is probably going to lose out anyways. And so as we're going through, I think there's going to be a lot of opportunity to negotiate in these commissions, especially as people are sitting. These are motivated sellers in this market, right? They're putting it on the market for whatever reason. And once we sat on for 30 plus days, while they went on day one, I'm not offering a commission, make them work for it, let them work for free. They're going to change their tune as days are going through, and they're still making that mortgage payment in the house that they wanted to purchase or the job that they need to get to. They're having a hard time getting to it. And so I don't, while yes, there's going to be some deals that we lose out on, and it's absolutely going to happen. I think that there's going to be less deals than what we truly think at this point. So 29.1.
When I did the survey a while back, I found that most of the buyer broker compensation, this was probably a month ago, was 2.8 and 2.5. There was very few twos, nothing under 2. And there were some 3s. One happened to be a broker-owned property. So now that'll fluctuate depending on the market. As you go into a buyer market, you may find that the compensation is going to be more. When it's a seller's market, it's probably going to be less. Kind of like our builders, right? And when they're making hay, all of a sudden our commission amounts go down, and when they're not making hay, all of a sudden now they're back up again. So I think all that's just going to be negotiated based on the market that we're in at this point.
So you bring up an interesting point, Kevin, about builders. You know, we generally write our contracts at a certain level. And, you know, we do discuss with our buyers that when we go into a builder may or may not offer much of a commission. And, you know, with Lennar offers 1%, and we've settled for that 1%. Now, I mean, if I'm showing people, you know, 80 houses and I end up, you know, waiting 11 months for 1%, you know, I guess if you chose to do this with a client, you could require the client to pay you the difference. Yes or no?
That's right. Yes, absolutely.
Even though that the purchase contract, I mean, I guess, does this have any impact on builders' purchase contracts because of the fact that we won't have this same language to put in there to require us to be paid?
No, it's still going to be impacted because we have to have a compensation agreement with our buyers and in place. And so you're going to negotiate that up front. Then it's up to you if you're willing to accept less for that particular deal, and then you do an amend extend for that one transaction.
Don't builders automatically already have their commission agreement form in their forms already? So I think you would just modify that one, right?
No, you want your own, because you don't know that that's all they're going to do. The only time that's going to happen is if they contact you and say, look, we want to go to Richmond Homes, we want to buy one. I would still just be in the habit. Don't be in the habit of shortcutting it, because if that deal doesn't work out, you want to be in a business relationship with them, go moving on after that too. Let me think if there was anything. I looked through the questions. It looks like just about everything was answered. Did I miss anybody's question in there?
Kevin, do you think that a reverse prospect email is a one-click away? So if I look up my listing and I know all of the agents who have people that are going to look at that could potentially see my listing, and I want to encourage them to come, and I want to market to them that we're going to offer whatever % commission, or we're open to negotiating a buyer agency compensation. And perhaps
so the answer is yes. I do think it's one click away. I think you could do just your own email to their email. You could do that.
Yeah, I'm saying I wouldn't do the reverse proxy email through the MLS. I don't like it anyways because it's just very blah and it doesn't really, if I'm trying to establish a relationship, I would prefer that the email come from my email to their email.
Yep. Yeah, I think you're fine there. I think it's going to come down to, you know, working through lazy brokers that don't respond in a timely manner, especially, you know, I would be dealing with that up front, showing the houses, and then having that conversation with my buyers, especially if you know, if they're the ones that you know cannot afford to pay you, then you don't want to be in that, you don't want to put them in that situation like Kimberly was saying. God, you'd hate for them to fall in love with this house, but those are your only three options. You either don't, you know, they instruct you not to show the property and they don't want to make a run at it. You get a hold of the listing agent and pursue it, or you take a chance, write a contract on it and find out. You know, like my attitude, but I don't play it. I think it depends on the price range you're playing in, and I don't have too many first-time home buyers. I don't have a problem if I can't get a hold of a listing agent. My client would like to write an offer on it, just making sure they understand the risk that they fall in love with this thing and they can't pursue it in the end because the seller is obstinate in their negotiating. Now, I will add some additional wrinkles to all this, just so we have lots of fun with it. RE Colorado is selling, as many of you know, and the reason they're selling is to create an arm's length transaction or arm's length relationship between the realtor board and the MLS. I'm not going to get into the weeds on whether it's good, bad, indifferent. It makes business sense. And they're saying they're protecting the MLS. Honestly, I think they're protecting the board and their members as much as they are the MLS. And so by creating the separation for any future potential antitrust and collusion lawsuits, one of the things that has come out, and this is not public information yet, however, the belief, and I think this is accurate, is with this separation, RE Colorado is not going to be policing this. They are not going to be the police of whether or not you have a competent.
Kevin, you paused. Hold on, Kevin.
And you don't have this, or you get into a lawsuit. Did you lose me?
Yeah, for a couple seconds.
I got unstable for a second there. Then you're going to be caught with your pants down if you don't have your compensation agreement in place prior to showing properties. I thought it was going to be highly unlikely the MLS was going to be able to be the police on this, and they're not anticipating being the police. And I don't think brokerage firms are going to be policing each other either. I think what's going to happen is that it's going to come to a head with the DOJ and the FTC, and I think they're going to mandate some federal changes in the next 4 to 6 months after they watch us kind of how we're going to start doing business in light of the settlement date starting August 17th.
And that's very real, right, Kevin?
Yeah.
I think that when we're looking at this thing, yes, NAR was the one that put in their settlement that the MLSs were going to police us. The MLSs wanted nothing to do with this, but NAR was like part of their settlement. They said it. The second thing is this, like DOJ has reserved the right to reopen this up and look at it at any point. I don't know what the official term is, but they put a bookmark in this thing. And they said at any point we can actually open this up, and it doesn't matter what the settlements look like, we can reinvestigate. And so they're going to look for the next couple months at what we're doing. They're going to say, okay, these people are putting it on their websites, or they're sending out these email blasts, and they're going to start doing it. And then they're going to make their final ruling, which they're also going to put another bookmark in to say we reserve the right to come look at it. They're going to look to see what we're doing to try to skirt the system and keep these commissions inflated, because that's what we're accused of, inflating commissions, and we're all doing it in coercion with everybody is the DOJ stance. And so everything that they're going to be watching us, and if we're putting on social media and all these people that are being cute where they're like, oh, we're going to use this acronym to say we're buyer agent friendly and all this stuff, like they're watching it. And guess who's going to turn them in? Angry real estate agents and angry consumers that get to see it because their agent shows them and they think it's cute. And then they're going to reopen up some stuff and they're going to put new rules in place.
Well, and there's also another wrinkle, and I think you're going to find as MLSs are no longer owned, they're decoupled from realtor boards and any relationship with NAR or their state board or their local boards. You're going to find more of them advocating for the seller's right for free speech, like the MLS on the East Coast right now, that's saying, wait a second, you're telling us that a seller's not allowed to utilize this as a marketing strategy, which is not fair to the seller. And so there's a chance, and I don't know what's going to happen with RE Colorado, but there's a chance that they are still trying to have some type of box that would allow for compensation. Now, it may be before, it may be after, or it may just be after, which I would be okay with. If we could just be able to keep the data after, so appraisers can see that, I think that would be a win as well. No matter how we do this, there's going to be, as Charles put it earlier in the year, about 4 months ago, it's just going to be more friction. We're still going to do transactions. We're still have the opportunity to do it the way we've done it in the past with the ultimate end in sight. It's just going to be more friction to get to the finish line is what's going to end up happening. And this has just created another layer of that friction. I'll throw one more out there just because I can. All this concern and worry over RE Colorado, I think it's just a waste of time and energy. I believe that right now, consumers find their properties, and it's not through your website. It's not through RE Colorado. It's not even when you set up an auto email and send them properties. It's coming from Zillow, Realtor.com, Homes.com. I don't know how many times my client, I'll have them on an auto email, and then they send me this listing or that listing. And I'm like, well, why the heck didn't I pick it up? Well, it was because it was in PPMLS, or it was in Iris and not in RE Colorado, or it was in some other MLS function. Worst case scenario is RE Colorado blows up. We all create a mutiny and we want to walk away from them. Right now, we can put our data into KWRI and push it out to these third-party websites that our consumers going to anyways. And then it's just a matter of figuring out how do we set up the showing? What service is that agent using to show those houses? Because the whole purpose of the MLS was a co-op. Well, co-op's gone. We don't have a co-op through the MLS anymore. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next 2 to 5 years if the sale goes through with the MLS, because they better show us value. Because right now, if I didn't want to put my stuff in the MLS, the consumer's still going to see it. And then all you have to do is contact me to find out how to show the property, and you're going to negotiate commission within the contract itself.
Again, I
Statewide
think that's why
MLS.
Gary Keller was ahead of the game on it.
Could be.
Yep. It's just a syndication issue at that point. We just got to figure out how to syndicate, and who knows, these MLSs could disappear. Absolutely.
And right now, there's only 3 ways you're showing a property. It's showing time, broker bay, or the agent themselves. Right? That's it. So it'd just be contacting those services directly.
Yep.
I don't
Awesome,
think
guys.
we're going to go that route, but I'm just saying, worst case scenario, if all of a sudden they want to double our fees or do something stupid, there's other options that are going to be available.
And we'll figure it out as we kind of go with this. Anybody have questions around 29? 29 is the biggest change to the CBS as far as compensation goes. There's some moving pieces in here. Any other questions?
I
Cool.
have a question, but it's not on
Yes.
regarding 29 though. So when do you want me to wait on that one?
Nope. Hit us with it real quick.
Okay, let's say you have somebody from out of state who is interested in having you send them properties. How does that work with all this? I mean, are
So
we
you're saying you just want to
required
put them on
to,
a drip campaign is all you're asking? Drip campaign, send it to somebody?
yeah, I mean, we don't have to do all this stuff for that.
No,
Okay.
you can send them an auto email through
Okay.
Colorado.
Okay.
I'm just
you guys-
I'm personally finding that most buyers are already searching without you. We're not the
Oh,
starting.
they are.
Yeah, they're starting somewhere else. You come into play when they actually want to see the house and write a contract. That's typically when we're coming into play. Now, there's some exceptions to that. I know that. But the reality is they're not looking to us, our IDX solution, or RE Colorado, or any of the MLSs as the service to find a property. They're looking at third-party providers, whether you like it or not, Zillow, Realtor.com, Homes.com are the ones they're going to, and they like their platforms, and they like how they get the information from them.
And really, guys, the only reason for these agreements to be put in place, if you were to read through the settlement is if you show them a home that's in the MLS. Brian, not to get into the weeds with this thing, but that's really all it is. If you're going to go show a home that's in the MLS, you have to have an agreement in place around compensation. That's it. Like, in all reality, if you're showing them FSBOs, technically, I don't think you need to have this. Now, again, don't create extra work, get the agreement in place and go show them everything. And if it's not in the MLS, technically, you don't need to have anything. It's just for showing houses.
So I have a question of how this might relate to Zillow and Redfin type agents. So at least on our houses, I've had a couple of, they are MLS agents, but they must be paying Zillow for leads. And they're like, hey, I got a Zillow showing request. Which, by the way, if you're a Zillow agent, they also require the Zillow agents to always make the request through showing time, which I had to call and message an agent and say, I'm sorry, I don't use showing time as it says in the MLS. Please request it through Broker Bay. And she's like, well, I'm a Zillow agent, so I have to request it through showing time. I was like, that's fine. I'm not approving it. So you'll just have to request it through Broker Bay too. But I'm curious how this is going to play out with some of those agents that are going and meeting people and showing them properties, and they clearly don't have any sort of agreement or pre-existing relationship, and how that's going to play out for those organizations. Because I personally always call Redfin agents, and if it's a Zillow request, because I want to know that whether they know that person or not, and remind them that they are responsible when they're on the property.
Well, I'll answer that. So
Yep.
It depends. It depends on whether or not they're part of the settlement. If they're an agent that's not an MLS member, and they can show properties because they're not under the same requirements that we are as part of the settlement. However, if they're part of the settlement, they will have to have a brokerage compensation agreement in place. Now, I think I've already seen a brokerage compensation agreement form from either Zillow or Redfin. I would have swore I saw that a couple of months ago. So I think
Zillow.
they've already created something.
Yeah, Zillow has it.
Yeah. So they actually have it in order for them to show property. Redfin most likely will use our form.
So if you're a Zillow agent and you get a request, they've already been handed a form from Zillow that they have to get that buyer to sign before they can show them that property.
Okay. Correct.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It doesn't hold its weight again because it's not a commission approved form. It's really just something that Zillow created, but that's what it is. I think that
they may start using our form too. We don't know at this point. If they're part of the settlement, they're under the same umbrella as we are. Here's the people that are not. I'm licensed, I do kind of my own deals and stuff, but I'm not a member of the MLS. I'm not on the realtor board. I'm not part of any settlement. And a buddy of mine says, hey, I'm interested in looking at some properties. That person would not have to do all this. It's kind of like, and this sucks, but it's kind of like back in the 07, 08, for those of us that were working then, when they came out with the equity skimming protection forms, in which, as licensed brokers, we had to make sure we used the Foreclosure Act, CBS 5 or whatever it was, which stated that we were not the buyer was not trying to take advantage of the seller. And so they created all these forms for us that were licensed. Well, guess what? It wasn't the licensed brokers that were doing this. It was the unlicensed people that were predators on trying to take advantage of people that were in foreclosure and trying to steal their homes from them. It's kind of like that. It's us Dudley Do-Rights that are doing everything basically right. We're the ones that are being suppressed this way and happen to adapt. And it's the ones that aren't part of any of this that are going to continue to go along and not have any issues at all. Now they may get sued, and if they get sued, they have no protection. They haven't had us. They weren't part of any settlement.
Yeah, so the bigger boutiques, I think, are probably going to be in the crosshairs, but onesie twosie deals here and there, they're probably safe in the grand scheme of things. I think it's also interesting to think about this. Think about what's happening on the East Coast. We don't typically see it a whole lot in Colorado, but when we're talking about fair housing, like in all those stings that are happening on the East Coast, I don't think that they're going to go through and put the resources to do that. And depending on who the administration is at the time and what their focus is. But I mean, that could be a very real thing where they get a phone call and say, can you go show me this house? And instead of like, do you treat all your customers the same? Do you have this agreement in place? And they could go forward and start opening lawsuits that way, like they do fair housing.
Yeah. Well, I'll go one step farther too. We had a person, there's a guy that is disabled and he goes into a lot of rural areas. And this happened to one of our restaurants in Bailey. And what he does is he goes into these restaurants and then he'll go to the restroom and he'll measure the access and everything. And if it's not up to the federal law, he's a lawyer. He throws a lawsuit at him, and a hefty one at that. So it's kind of like that.
Yeah. So Amanda, to answer your question, I don't think any of us know like what's going to really happen with these people. It just depends on what administration wants to focus on, and are they going to put more resources and time into it?
Well, the commission's not going to police this at all. So let's be real clear. The commission is helping us by allowing these forms to be promulgated through the Colorado Real Estate Commission. However, they're not enforcing when they're used and how they're used necessarily. Well, obviously the listing agreement they would, but that's not part of their enforcement on showing properties. This is all through the court system. And I think, like I said earlier, 4 to 6 months, the DOJ is going to weigh in again, and they're possibly going to issue some federal regulations that then would require the state to now change how they're viewing and doing business and enforcing it with the brokers.
Yep.
And I think Marcia Waters would prefer that. Sorry, I didn't mean to step on you there, Charles.
No, you're good. You're good. Yeah, absolutely. But as we're looking at this, right, brokerage disclosure, we kind of already pretty much talked about this. No changes for the most part, right? They did do a little bit, convey written offers, brokerage disclosure to buyer is not a contract. Cool, got it. And then this is what Kevin was talking about, right? Here's your buyer's broker compensation agreement. And really all this is for is, you're going in through and you're having a conversation with someone that you meet at an open house. Real preliminary stuff here, right? It says in consideration of the services to be performed by the buyer broker's brokerage firm will be paid a fee equal to this percentage or this purchase price. And again, Kevin was saying this is mostly when we're operating as someone in a customer relationship.
Nope.
And
TB. Got to be a TB.
I'm sorry, yep.
Cannot be a customer and use that form. You got to be TB.
As far as the compensation goes.
Yes, as far as the compensation goes. If you're representing the seller, then they could be a customer, but you don't fill out the third page. If you're picking them up as a potential buyer, then it's got to be a minimum TB. You can't be in a buyer agency agreement unless you have a listing agreement in writing. So the only thing you can be is a TB, but it can't be a customer and fill out that third page.
Right. Sorry about that. Yes. And so as we're going through, guys, this is what it is. And so we're going through and it's talking about the success fee. It's talking about what the actual dollars are. And right, it says broker is authorized and instructed to request payment of the success fee from one or more of both of these, right? So the seller's brokerage firm or the seller. Buyer is obligated to pay. So again, all of these forms, buyer is obligated to pay. There is no more buyer doesn't pay, put it off to the seller. It's buyer will, seller may, or buyer will. Those are our only two options going forward. And we need to be making sure that we're absolutely comfortable having that conversation and not discounting our rates to get our people comfortable with it. Because again, it's going to be very hard to get them to come up to a competitive commission if we've lowballed it so low to get them to sign. And then they say, well, to Kevin's point, oh, there's, $8,000. How come we don't just offer less or ask them to give me an $8,000 concession or buy down this stuff for me? They will be looking for that commission back in their pockets, in our thoughts.
Quick question. So up to this point, we've always had to have the brokerage disclosure to brokerage disclosure, this form, as well as the exclusive right to buy. If I have somebody who wants to sign an exclusive right to buy right away, do I use both forms still, or
I would stay in the habit. I think it's a good habit. Technically, you don't have to have it if you get the listing agreement signed prior to showing property.
Okay.
I just hate to let that go, and then this changes down the road, and now we've got bad habits at that point. when I took over Castle Rock, they have that bad habit. And I love how everyone who isn't filling it out, oh, I'd never showed any properties prior to get my listing agreement. Really?
Right.
Really?
And it's not even just the showing, Kevin, right? I mean, you could literally be just sending them houses to look at. And I think that constitutes a TB status. And so they can actually go back, and that can be audited, right? You can actually go back and someone files a complaint against you and there was no documentation. They're like, this person's been sending me emails for a year of houses to look at that's in my price point. And they can actually show that. Yeah, guys, this is one of those things where, yeah, absolutely. In theory, if you get the exclusive rights signed immediately, you don't need this. But let's be honest with everyone in this room. You are not getting the exclusive rights signed at your first conversation about real estate. No one in this room. So let's make sure that we're getting it signed.
Me included.
I have a quick question. So if I thought you said in order to send them, like set them on a drip campaign, we wouldn't need this.
No, that's so in the compensation agreement that is being mandated at this point, you do not need to have a compensation agreement in place to put someone on a drip campaign. The compensation agreement is only if you go and show a house. That's the NAR settlement.
Open a door.
Yep. Open a door and go look through it. But what this agreement is this is laying out playground rules about what we're doing for people if we're not getting an agreement signed. And so this is why in our brokerage, we have this signed, even if you're getting an agency. And this is what gets funny because these are, you know, if you've sent this complaint, you're not the only person that has to us, right? Where someone's like, why do I have to get this signed? I have the agency agreement already signed. It's like, well, because for the last year, you've been sending them houses and you did not have any documentation. Even though you just got all your docs signed today, we still need this one because this is your CYA about showing that you actually had the conversation, even though you didn't do it in a timely manner.
I will
But
say
are
that I
we-
do. Go ahead.
Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. But do we have to then have this now signed in order to send someone, for instance, just an MLS search?
Well, I think that's what the thing. So let's look at this. And so a transaction broker assists the buyer or seller on both throughout a real estate transaction by performing terms of any written or oral agreement, fulfilling information and parties, right? So we know as a TB is you are just pushing paper and you're doing what they tell you. You're just not a consultant. You don't have a fiduciary responsibility. So I think that someone says, hey, can you show me all the houses that are in a $400,000 price range? And you actually put them on a drip campaign, you're operating as a transaction broker in that capacity. You are still doing real estate services.
I will say, I think we have to have a brokerage compensation agreement, even if you're going to do a virtual showing. So if you're going to physically go over to the house, open the door and do a FaceTime around the property, you do need that compensation agreement in place.
Yeah, so if you're going to go show a house, Shelby, you need to have a compensation agreement in place. If you're sending someone on a drip campaign, you should have this. Now I know we're on a recorded line and hopefully this doesn't get sent out. Actually pause it.